welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by the Amazonian Plant Healing Center, the Temple of the Way of Light. I've worked at the temple for a number of years now, and I can really attest to the quality of the work that they do. They're located in the Peruvian jungle outside the city of Iquitos, and they run 12-day retreats in which they have 6 ceremonies. They're predominantly working with the plant medicine ayahuasca, working with a group of people called the Shipibo people, which have a really long lineage and I would say mastery of working with ayahuasca. There's an amazing support staff there, really great facilitators, yoga teachers, an amazing integration team, just an all-around really great support staff, which really helps to facilitate going really deeply into this plant medicine work. So if you're looking for a center to really go deeply into this world of plant medicine, specifically with ayahuasca, then the temple is a really wonderful place. They've been closed, unfortunately, for most of the pandemic, but last month in August they reopened and they are back open. So if you'd like more information about them, you can check out their website at templeofthewayoflight.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Also, myself and my colleague Marav Artsy, who I interviewed, I believe, in episode 28 of this podcast, we're running dietas or diets here in the Sacred Valley of Peru, and that's a really amazing opportunity to go really deeply into this world of plant medicine, to work with a particular plant, working both with myself and Marav, a man and a woman, working in the lineages that we've trained in, which really is a mix of a lot of different things, but especially with an emphasis on working with tobacco and trees. It's a beautiful opportunity to go into a period of isolation, of restriction, of fasting, and working with these very powerful plant medicines and plant teachers. So if you'd like more information about that, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org and Marav's site at tobaccodiets.com. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really beautiful option. It's a subscription service for as little as $1 a month. You can sign up. There's different tiers you can sign up for, and with those different tiers, you get different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. So that's a really big help to me. If you feel like you've been gaining some benefit or insight or knowledge from this podcast, that's a really beautiful way of giving back. To all the people who have done that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. There's also the ability to direct donate via PayPal. And also now with the YouTube channel, there's the option to join the channel, getting back a lot of the same perks as the Patreon page. So I'll put a link to all 3 of those in the show notes. If you're not able to do that, simply subscribing to the show is really big help. So on the YouTube channel, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, that's a really big help. It may seem like a small thing, but with the algorithms, it really helps to get the show out to a bigger audience. And then if you're listening to this, going on Apple Podcasts, hitting the subscribe or follow button and leaving a starred rating and a short review, that's also a really big help. So I think that's it. My guest for today is Jerónimo Mazarrasa, and I found out about Jerónimo a number of years ago. I think I listened to a talk that he was giving, and I really liked what he had to say. As I mentioned in the episode, I think he has a really beautiful way of taking a lot of these topics and speaking really beautifully about them from a very measured, I think from a very neutral place that's nuanced and really shows both sides. He's been doing this work for a long time, working with plants in many different aspects, and now he's one of the primary people who works for an organization called ICEERS, which is one of the big organizations that works for the promotion and I think the best practices of working with plant medicines and psychedelics, and especially as this work begins to expand, how that looks in the future. They're an organization based in Barcelona in Spain, and sometimes they're considered like the European counterpart to the American organization MAPS. So they're doing amazing work. I've worked with some of the people from ICEERS, Irene, who I interviewed in one of the episodes. She's also part of that. And I think they're doing really important work, and I think Jerónimo has a really important voice. So I think and hope you guys will all get a lot out of this episode. I really enjoyed speaking with him. I always learn when I listen to him, and I think you all really will too. So I think that's it. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jerónimo.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, great. Well, welcome. We were just talking a little bit before the podcast. We have a mutual friend, Irene, and I worked with her for a number of years at the big Amazonian plant healing center, the Temple of the Way of Light. She came down, I think, working for ICEERS, doing some of your research program that was in collaboration with the temple. And she's a great woman. She's a dear friend, and I can't remember where I heard your name from. I'm not sure if it was from her, or maybe I saw you on a video or a podcast. I can't remember, but I remember I really enjoyed you speaking. I don't listen to a lot of people in this field speak. It's just something that I'm kind of very much engrossed in my own work. But I happened to come across you, and I really liked what you had to say. I felt you had a really beautiful way of expressing like a lot of very diverse ideas, and something I found quite beautiful was kind of your ability to present things without a lot of emotional charge. Sometimes when things are presented, there's there's a very clear kind of view behind it, and I think you have a really nice ability to say things from a rather neutral perspective, which I think is a sign of wisdom, seeing things from both sides. So I know you do a lot, so we'll kind of see where this conversation goes. But maybe to start, just to introduce yourself to the audience and a little bit about your background and who you are, how you ended up doing this work that you're doing today.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Jerónimo. I am from Spain, and if we're going to talk about, I think most of the conversation we use what sort of plants teachers. My own path with that started 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, out of a personal interest that I had, and also a sort of very strong realization that I had when the first time I took these plants with an indigenous shaman, it's Ololwiki seeds. They're these sort of blue morning glory seeds, which I took in Oaxaca, Mexico, with a traditional healer, Mazatec traditional healer. And it really, the difference, the experience per se was not, I would say that I've had stronger experiences already just with my friends in more, recreational contexts or party contexts, but the experience itself was so completely different, and the whole notion that you could use these states, which I was familiar with, but focused on very concrete sort of, you can call it healing, you can call it personal growth, you can call it insight, you can call it, was really, I think it was sort of a turning point for me. I became very, very fascinated by all of this. I worked on a couple of documentaries. I worked at the end on 4 documentaries. All of them revolved around the idea of indigenous knowledge, especially South American indigenous knowledge, and all of them had some relationship to, let's call them psychoactive plants. But the truth is that in a way the documentaries for me were more of an instrument or a means than an end in themselves. I found that it was really, really useful, and I always recommend people, if they are interested in something, that they make a documentary about it, even if you never finish the documentary, because it's a wonderful door opener. So you can, if you're interested in a topic and you find people who are doing interesting things around that topic, you can always write to them and say, I'm doing a documentary or a podcast, and I would very much like to talk to you about this. And they would say, sure, of course. And then they would sit down with you, and and they would talk all evening, and this I found wonderful, because of the access and the possibilities that working on the documentary gave me. That was about 10 years. That was about 10 years of my life. Documentaries they're a tough business. I always had a day job while I was doing the documentaries. At some points I was able to just do documentaries, but it was short, just a couple of years out of those 10 years. I think the rest of the time there was always something else going on. And also towards the end of those 10 years, I had amazing experience. I learned a lot. I became very interested in a number of topics which I started talking about, which is perhaps some of the things that you might have seen earlier on. I spoke many years, starting in 2005, I started to talk about this sort of the encounter between sort of indigenous knowledge and, I don't know, let's call it Western Western people who were curious about this, and all of the strange encounters and misencounters that happen, and all the misunderstandings and this sort of thing that was not so spoken about 15 years ago of appropriation of indigenous knowledge. It was very much spoken about in sort of like anthropological circles, but not so much in sort of plant people who were interested in plants, and also because of my own process being very curious about South American plant shamanism, and my own process about, thanks to documentary, being able to access or get close to some of these things. And at the same time, my own process at, being very, carrying a lot of prejudices and misconceptions and projections and romantic romantic projections about that whole thing, and being very wrong about it, and sort of reflecting and thinking about my own process of this encounter, and also seeing many other people, seekers like myself, some of them, much braver than me, going quite deep into the jungles of South America, looking for an indigenous healer that would teach them, and very often having more misadventures than adventures, and coming sort of disappointed with the whole thing. This whole topic became, I was very interested by all of this. But towards the end of the 10 years, and after these 4 documentaries, I also came to think that my personal commitment was to these plants and to these cultures, not to the filmmaking trade, and that as a matter of fact, seeing my own documentary, the one that was most involved in, which is nearly 10 years of work for about 90 minutes of film, seeing how much work and effort and I put into it, that perhaps there were more effective things that I could do for these plants and these cultures than taking 10 years to make 90 minutes of video. So at this point, I'd already begun to drift towards more sort of like activist role around the same, let's call it, culture. And then so I collaborated with a number of things that were happening in Spain. There was an early organization called Eleusis, Asociación Eleusis, that was organizing talks and seminars around this, and which later morphed into what is called the Platform for the Defense of Ayahuasca, which is an organization that it's an organization of people working towards the better use of ayahuasca practices that's been existing in Spain for a number of years. And also I began to collaborate with ICEERS. At first, just a few things here and there. It was more 6 or 7 years ago. And then more and more intensely. And now working full-time on it for the past about couple of years. The focus of my work has sort of mutated with time towards a pretty it's a pretty rare niche, I would say. But basically, a lot of my work right now and foreseeable for the next few years has to do with ceremonial plant use outside of the countries of origin. So I would just take the case of ayahuasca, which is perhaps the most widely known. Ayahuasca, as we all know, has expanded quite far. It can now, outside of the Amazon, and it can now be found pretty much all over the world. One can find ayahuasca ceremonies. Most of them resemble somewhat the sort of ayahuasca ceremonies that one will see in the jungle. For example, in the basic structure in which there is one person that serves the ayahuasca, there's a group of people that receive this drink. The person that serves is somewhat responsible for what happens during the night, is responsible for taking care of the participants. The person who serves also usually provides some sort of music or singing or energetic work or spiritual work. It takes different shapes. So there's a person who serves and guides, and there's a group who sort of receives this. This might seem, kind of obvious and common sense, but actually, in terms of the history of how these plants arrive from South America into the Western world, peyote, tobacco, coca, even cocoa, it's the first time that this happens. It is the first time that the plant travels with a sort of context of use that is recognizable. So the way that we take, for example, psychedelic mushrooms, which are perhaps the most popular ethnobotanical, are very, very, very different from the way, traditional use of Mazatec people. Even though a number of people had been visiting the Mazatec people and taking mushrooms in traditional contexts, and these had been happening since the 60s, so much earlier than ayahuasca, which really sort of starts in the 80s. But actually, most of our mushroom use outside of the countries of use of origin does not resemble the traditional use. That's not the case with ayahuasca. It's a unique phenomenon. I don't think it's a unique phenomenon. I think we will see more of it, but perhaps ayahuasca is the first. So what I am interested in is, okay, now we have ayahuasca use outside of the countries of origin. This is the reason why it's happening. It's because people find it useful. The reason why people drink ayahuasca and keep drinking ayahuasca is because people somehow find that, let's just say it and simplify a lot, that they feel that they are better off than before they did it. And they keep doing it, just being very, very sort of basic. I think this basic thing applies not just to us, it can be traced back all the way to the beginning of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a formula, so it's not a plant. It's a combination, it has to be prepared. It's a process. So because it is a process, we can imagine that somebody discovered or invented this process. All chances are it's an indigenous person, maybe more than one, in the Amazon a long, long time ago. So let's just try to mentally go back there. This person does this. This person puts together these two plants, cooks them, and makes ayahuasca as we know it for the first time. Now, this person has discovered something new, and this person tries it on themselves and discovers that this is interesting and that they feel better than before. Now, the next step is, how are you going to talk about this to your neighbors? Your neighbors these are people in your tribe. They're probably going to be a little bit suspicious about this. They're not going to, what is this? I've never seen it before. Doesn't taste very good. They will try and they become themselves interested and they become convinced. And from there, somehow it jumps to the next tribe. And we can also imagine resistance from the next tribe. But eventually it takes over, and then from the next tribe, and then from the next tribe. And from that to today, more than 70 indigenous groups in the Amazon that use ayahuasca. And then from there, it jumps to the cities of the jungle. And then from there, it jumps to other cities that are not in the jungle. And then from there, it jumps all the way to us. And this jump always happens in the same way. People who are originally suspicious of this eventually become interested. And then they keep doing it because it's, let's just say, useful. Okay, so now we are outside of the countries of origin. We're in Spain, 2021. There's right now, I estimate, hundreds of people who are facilitating ayahuasca sessions in Spain. Now, this is a very new activity. It's on a gray area of the law, and it's also in a sort of cultural gray area. Like, what is this practice? This doesn't resemble anything that we actually do ourselves. Some part of it has to do with spirituality, but it doesn't resemble our spiritual practices that we're familiar with from Judeo-Christian origin. Some of it resembles sort of medicine or medicinal stuff, but it doesn't really resemble either how we practice medicine. And some of it resembles a sort of personal growth or personal development or self-knowledge, a sort of personal inquiry, that you could call it something that has to do with meaning and being in the world and how should one live one's life. But again, it also doesn't resemble anything that we're familiar with. We deal with these things in psychology or in philosophy, but generally we're not by sitting in a circle and taking a plant. Now, I believe that 50, 100 or 200 years into the future, these practices will be fully integrated in our societies. The reason why I believe it is because when I look back to other societies, I've seen the same process. Right now there's 72, like more than 70 indigenous groups who participate in ayahuasca. Somewhere in the past, there was not 72, there was 30, or there was, and there was 12, and there was just one. So it expanded and it became part of the culture there. And it became part of the culture in the cities too. And it became part of the culture of not the indigenous people, but mixed blood population of the Amazon as well. And now it's becoming part of the lives of people in places like Spain. It's the nature of this. So I am working from the assumption that sometime in the future this will be integrated in the culture. And my work consists in thinking about how can I help this happen in the best possible way. So if we were to integrate, if we can imagine 20, 50 years into the future, these practices being integrated into outside of the countries of origin, well, what would we like that to look like? What would need to change? What type of regulatory frameworks are necessary? Is this going to be considered a new profession? Is this going to be part of established medicine? Is this going to be part of alternative medicine? Is this not going to be medicine? Is this going to be some sort of spiritual practice? Is this going to be none of the above? Is this going to be considered some sort of training or university? I work with one person who guides ayahuasca sessions now for a long time, and he said something that he said that he considered ayahuasca to be education for adults, and I thought that was a really interesting perspective. But these things we don't know, but we know that we need to start thinking about them. And we need to start preparing for them. And there's two types of things that need to, for these practices to be integrated into the societies, two things will have to change. The societies will have to change in order to accept this. And this includes everything from the sort of like the narratives and the cultural milieu and how people understand these things and how the culture sort of perceives and receives this, so, and the government and the laws that need to change. So, the society itself has to make some changes, but also very likely the people that are working with the plants will have to make some changes as well in order to adapt to how society as we know it today expects to relate to things. And and it's how it deals with safety, how it deals with many many different things. So I am thinking about all of these things at every level. And me and a group of collaborators, we're trying to first of all imagine the 15, 20 years into the future, a sort of an ideal, a sort of even a utopian vision of how this could be integrated in Western societies. It doesn't mean that we believe that it will happen, but you need to have a place where you want to get to. You need to have a sort of a reference point, a North Star. You need a model. You need a lighthouse. And say, we are working for this. 50 years from now, we want that, this is integrated in this way and people, blah, 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 blah. And then we sort of work backwards in terms of what changes need to happen and in which order and how could this happen. And then part of the work also has to do with what could be the setbacks. What are the things that could throw everything out of that could completely derail this process? For example, a moral panic, like it happened with LSD in the 70s, and also like it happened with MDMA in the 80s. And the tendency, this is a very strong pattern as new substances enter the mainstream. So there's also a part of it that has to do with sort of counterbalancing or counteracting possible reactions. The work, my day job, while I was doing documentaries, was for many years something that is called user experience design. I'm not going to go into what it is. I'm just going to say that it has to do with making websites and apps, but there's a certain and other things. It has to do with building things for other people. But there's a certain way of thinking and a certain sort of methodology to do the work, which is about how do you make plans and invent things that don't exist yet. That I have found very, very useful as I develop this other, much more ambitious work. That's sort of what lays underneath all of these, in terms of even this idea of how you paint the perfect future and then work things backwards, and how do you plan for all of this. All of this comes from this type of work. And that's it.
Yeah, this is great. There's a ton there. One of the things that came up, and as we're speaking about ayahuasca, and I think you spoke about it really beautifully, but I think there's often this conception that it's only indigenous people working with ayahuasca, and as you said, also this word appropriation, and you kind of mapped it out, this really interesting trajectory that it took, that most likely it was found or experimented by an indigenous person, however they found it, whether it was through using another plant or through some divine intervention, a dream, I'm sure there's many ways of looking at that, and many indigenous people I've talked to have very different stories, but often it's something in the lines of some sort of direct transmission. But this really interesting trajectory that you were speaking of, that it went from one person to maybe a family, to a community, to a wider community, to other communities. to even this idea that I think a lot of people, are maybe not familiar with, even by name, like this idea of mestizo, like, and even in South America, the vast majority of people would probably identify themselves as mestizo. And then moving from that into these, these potentially other communities like churches, these big churches in Brazil. And then, as you said, outward into the world at large, but there's that common thread. It is a very natural expansion. So maybe if you can talk a little about that, because it seems like you have at least to some degree a familiarity with those different levels, the spending time with indigenous communities, spending time with mestizo communities, to some degree, maybe some of these like large churches like Santo Daime, UDV. And then obviously you're in Spain now, and I'm sure to some degree you have experience of working outside. So what would you describe maybe as the commonalities in that, which, you did touch on, that it all came from a common source, but also maybe differences that you've seen, and how these different groups are not only maybe their origins, but or how they're working with it in a technical manner, but even the way they think about it, whether it's purely for something physical, like this idea of la purga, that it's just cleaning us, or for other people this more spiritual connection, or this idea of bringing community together, resolving problems, or maybe as that line expands, this idea of like self-improvement, of enlightenment, of moving up the spiritual ladder, so to speak. So I know that's kind of a big question, but anything that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, when like I said, when we started working on the documentary, the original idea was that we were going to do a series. This I'm taking you now back to early 2000s, and we were going to do one per plant. And we started with Ololwiki and actually Salvia minorum. We went to the Mazatecs to follow that up, and then after we were filming that, then the next time that we got together, we said, what should we research now? And my partner then, Mark, said, I think we should do ayahuasca. This was 2003 and 2002, and ayahuasca was quite rare then. I mean, there was very little actually online about it, and most of it was about the Santo Daime. So we met in Brazil. And we filmed some of sort of urban mestizo use, and also we went to Rio Branco, and we began to record with the churches, the Santo Daime, the Barquinha, and also the União da Vegetal. And what really surprised me about this was that the work that we had done in Mexico around salvia and around Ololwiki and even the mushrooms, it felt a little bit like it was like very investigative, and it was almost like archaeology. You were looking for the last remnants of what looked like dying cultures. So without mistake, when people spoke about the salvia use or about the mushroom use, they would describe a time in the past where there was more, and there was more knowledge, and there was more widely spread use, and now there was this very little thing that was left. And that was the work that we were doing. So when I arrived to Brazil and I discovered ayahuasca cultures, I was completely amazed, because it was the opposite. Far from being the last remnants of sort of something that had been much bigger, it was a thriving culture in expansion, huge. Thousands of people, the União da Vegetal is, I can't remember, tens of thousands, I think 30,000 members. The Santo Daime is about 16,000 members, tens of thousands of people drinking ayahuasca regularly every week, just in Brazil. This is not, this is very, very far from the traditional use of, peyote or mushrooms or any of these other power plants. So I became very fascinated with this, and one of the original ideas about the documentary was that perhaps we could make a sort of family portrait, and we could sort of in one film paint or show all the different traditional uses that were associated with ayahuasca. For a number of years, this was the objective, and that meant that we kept visiting places and filming with them and trying to get the entire sort of spectrum of this. So, we filmed in Peru and in Brazil with the churches, and later in Colombia and different indigenous groups and different. It took a number of years before I realized that it was absolutely impossible to fit a family picture of traditional ayahuasca uses in one film, or maybe even in 10 films. It was too large and too rich and too varied, like you said. So there's absolutely everything from, what is believed to be the most traditional uses, like you can see in the Baupés in Colombia still, and in Santa Rivers, what is called the Yurupari complex. So this is a group of, in the Upper Rio Negro, this is a complex of very traditional cultures that use ayahuasca, just the yaje, usually cold extraction, together also with a number of other, with tobacco and with coca, in what are, something that we believe was very widespread in the Amazon, not so much now anymore, which are very large dances that happen regularly in very large malocas, which are communal houses. These dances happen around a certain a central calendar of yearly things. It's when the fish go up the stream, when the pineapples ripen, when different times of the year, there will be these really big celebrations. The entire group would participate. Ayahuasca and other things would be consumed, and certain songs and certain legends and certain dances would be performed that were only for those days, and that basically retold how that day connected to the day at the beginning of the universe, when these things begin to happen for the first time. I'm not doing the best job at describing this. It has to do with their myths, the history of the group, where they come from and who they are, and the way in which this is not just celebrated but reenacted by these dances, in which they all participated, and the feathers, and this is still happening in the Amazon, albeit in just a very few places. Then, as the jungle gets colonized, which is that appalling story of genocide and terrible stuff that happened, especially around the rubber boom and rubber extraction, most of this is destroyed. Indigenous groups are sort of broken up, they die, there's a huge, massive deaths, and they're brought back by missionaries together in this, they're called reductions, in these groups, in this sort of around a church, where a number of different groups are joined, and out of these sort of the new groups and new cultures emerge, and also a new way of using ayahuasca that is no longer this sort of group culturally very strongly tied to the sense of self of the people. I don't know how else to say this, and which happen in a group thing, but instead very focused on individual healing of people, still with connection to the traditions and the spirits and the stuff, but now focus very much on individual healing of groups of people who had been incredibly abused for hundreds of years. And there ayahuasca takes a different sort of role, also very important, also tied to the sense of self and the survival but it takes a different shape. There's another sort of jump that happens when it goes from those groups to sort of mestizo, mixed blood, people who are half indigenous and half colonist, or in general, these are people who live in South America, are from South America. They don't have a clear sense of an ethnic identity. They don't consider themselves to be of this group or that group. And they consider themselves Peruvian or Brazilian, but their culture and itself is a mixture of indigenous and European. There emerges this sort of folk healing practices, which is what develops in the cities in Iquitos and what is called vegetalismo, which is no longer usually it still calls back to the indigenous groups. It uses songs that has very often words in Quechua or in indigenous languages, but it's already a sort of urban thing. And also in parallel in Brazil, these things happen with the churches, where basically groups of descendants of African slaves who had been brought to the coast of Brazil then emigrate to the jungle for the rubber boom, and then they come in contact with indigenous groups and with ayahuasca. And they develop something which is really unique and extraordinary out of Brazil, which is this sort of syncretic mixture, which is this sort of the core is the ayahuasca is indigenous. The spiritual figures are Christian, but the spirituality is African in terms of in terms of how the spirituality is practiced. I don't. A proper anthropologist would do a much better job than me of explaining this. I'm really ahead of making. I really apologize if I'm not doing a very precise job. It's not fully off the mark, but it's not the best description what I give. So but these churches have influences of all three things. You can see very strong African influence of African spirituality and spirit possession and all of this. There's the ayahuasca being consumed, and there's the Christian sort of figures and saints and stuff. And then there's further jumps as we get to where we are, where sort of people that have been trained as psychologists, psychiatrists, and therapists also in the Western world become interested in this, and they use it in a way that is more have to do with sort of exploration to deal with trauma, with psychological pain, sort of like life purpose, and making difficult decisions and finding this is the shape that it takes as it takes one more jump towards the outside of the countries of origin. So now when you look at all of these practices together, it seems that there's not much coherence. It seems like in every place they used ayahuasca for something different. In one place it was about community and identity, mostly. In another place it seemed to be more about individual healing, and then in the next jump it seemed to be more about like a spiritual practice, a sort of sacrament or communion, and yet in another place it seems to be about sort of like psychological insight but that's a very nearsighted view of what's happening. For me, the concept that is really useful here is from Spanish psychologist, anthropologist Ferigla, who wrote about this, and he said that what ayahuasca is an adaptogen. So it's basically a substance that can be said that it helps people adapt to their context, to their life, to their needs in very particular context, and in different contexts, these needs are different. So in the tribal setting, the communal and tribal sort of identity and the coherence and the strength of the group is the survival of the group. So these things are super important for adapting to it. In a place where the tribal coherence has been lost, and now people are alone, and they're actually going through colonialism and abuse, then individual survival becomes really important, and the ayahuasca provides that, helps people deal with individual healing. Then in these groups of African descendants of African slaves who had lost their original they've been taken from Africa, dropped in America, and then taken to the jungle, to another group of people which is completely abused and brutalized. They find on it again a community, and a connection not just to spirituality, but to their own sort of source of spirituality, to something that came from there. And then as we get to the Western world, to our world, where we are, living, very atomized life, very individualistic lives, and where most of our sort of survival things are taken care of. We're not going hungry. We don't lack clothes. We don't like, most of our issues revolve not around survival, physical survival, but around meaning. Do I like my work? Do I like what I'm doing with my life? What is my purpose? What should I do with myself? These sort of things. Then we find that ayahuasca takes this role. So I would say the underlying commonalities throughout this process, one is the expansion that is always from one person to the next, from one family to the next, from one group to the next, the expansion to the neighbors, let's call it. So ayahuasca is like an oil stain that just keeps growing. That's a constant, The other one is this, that wherever it goes, it tends to function as an adaptogen. It helps people adapt to their lives, whatever their lives require, whatever their needs, they need, that changes. But the ayahuasca seems to serve that and take shape around this. And then the other part that I think it's really important, because I think it's one of the things that are often overlooked. It's the ceremony and the song. So there's always a ritual and there's always music. Now the ritual changes and the music changes, but there's always a ritual and there's always some sort of music. And I think it's a very important key as well that is often, like I say, overlooked. It seems that what's important is the substance. I don't think so. I think the substance itself brings with it this need. So there was another spin of this. I thought, no, instead of making a documentary that is a family picture, I wanted to make a documentary that was just going to be songs of ayahuasca, and I would just be like one song in each of the different contexts. Now there's a guy, what's his name, Moon. I can't remember. He already did a beautiful series of that. You can find it online, and there's literally dozens of clips from different ayahuasca practices all over the world. But what's constant in there, where everything changes, the costumes, the people, the songs, the language, the theme, is that these sort of songs of ayahuasca that are usually received under the effects of ayahuasca, they're sort of inspired or composed under the effects of ayahuasca, that are meant to be sung while on the effects of ayahuasca, and that they themselves sort of carry, modulate, and sort of sustain the experience, and the set of ritual practices around it. So how do we open when people drink all at the same time? What do we do in the middle? How do we close? This is always present, again, in different shapes. So I would say those are like the four underlying common elements: the expansion, the uses that are adaptogenic, the music, and the ceremony. And these are sort of the underlying commonalities in something that in a process that is actually thousands of years old, that we will continue to see probably expanding into the future, and that if you look too close, it looks like it's very diverse and different, and there's not very much in common from one place to the other.
This is a big question, so if it seems too much, don't hesitate. But like, obviously, this adaptogenic quality, I think for anyone who's done this work, it's something they can very much see. Even these themes of like calling it Mother Ayahuasca, if someone has that kind of program in their mind that's very often the experience in which they see their experience through. If someone is coming with this idea that I need to heal my trauma, then that can be their experience. If it's, I need clarity in my life, or, even as you said, these different cultures, like, something fascinating is having worked with people coming from India, like often their experience is very much through that lens of, communing with or having experience of Maya and communicating with Krishna. And so there's obviously this quality that's very adaptogenic, very, very personal. And, kind of this saying that's maybe overused, but that ayahuasca is always giving you what you need, not necessarily what you want, but what you need. And yet at the same time, there's this other side, which you often hear people speak about, which is this idea that the medicine is telling me something, as if it's not just a direct relationship with me and the medicine, but that there's some higher aspect, whether it's an innate intelligence of the medicine or God or spirit, however one wants to look at that, but that there's a fundamental truth or teaching that's all of these plants, but we're speaking about ayahuasca, that there is something that's being taught, like, and kind of that dichotomy that you mentioned, that difference between the adaptogen and the commonality. So I know it's a difficult question, but from your experience, do you have a sense that there is some, however we want to look at it, higher intelligence or truth that a plant like ayahuasca is moving people towards, this communality? Or is it just something that's so personal, and it's such this kind of amazing adaptogenic entity that really it can't be separated from the person who's taking it?
It's very, I would say within the different ayahuasca cultures themselves, this is a big question. So one time I saw, I was in it's not called it's called a work, I believe, by the União da Vegetal, which is the largest church in Brazil. It's not so well known, but it's quite large, and it's very, very different from anything that we can imagine around ayahuasca. They have something that looks more like a sort of Socratic dialogue. They drink ayahuasca and they speak mostly, and they speak about quite deep stuff, sometimes very spiritual, sometimes very philosophical. And people ask questions of the mestre, who's the man who runs the session. And one time a man asked, mestre, how can we tell the difference between the true intuition and the voice of our ego? Which is, it's sort of, I think it's where it's where this thing goes. The problem, quote unquote, is that, yes, it looks like ayahuasca is telling you things, but when ayahuasca tells you things, accepting that happens, or when you're just thinking out loud in your head, you're talking to yourself, it sort of sounds exactly the same. It's just a voice in your head saying things. This is also what this man was asking at the UDV session. I had an idea inside of me, something, I had a notion, an insight. How do I know if this is, valid and true intuition, or is actually just the voice of my ego? Because it actually sounds the same. It's just a voice in your head saying something, right? And basically, the answer of the mestre, which I think it's sort of also a universal answer, it is also the path that I follow myself in these circumstances when I have the same doubts myself. I've had, nights when ayahuasca has told me things that about what I should do with my life, which I didn't know whether to believe or not. And they were quite extreme. They would say this would never work, or you should, stop all relationships with this person. And then you're like, oh, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? Is this true insight, or is this just my fears that was in my... What the Mestre said, the answer that he gave was that indeed, these two things are the same, sound the same. They're not the same, but they can sound the same. And the process of learning to discern one from the other is the work itself. That's what you are going to learn to do. The way that he presented it, and I think is a very, very useful metaphor that I've also heard in other places. It's a notion of transparency. So in order to be able to actually receive, let's call it, messages from the spiritual world or from a higher self, or the voice of your true intuition, if for people that are uncomfortable with all of these things, it's okay. The way to separate, the good insights from the, fear, ego, etc., is to become so transparent that whatever messages come from that place, which is very deep, are not sort of twisted so the work itself is one of transparency, is one of getting out of the way. And that means working on your anger, on your jealousy, on your ego, on your vanity. And these are all the things that will sort of, color or shape whatever sort of higher knowledge one is trying to attain. And it's in this process of becoming transparent that one can trust more and more the messages. And if one is not transparent, then actually these messages can often become, and people get very confused, and they, ayahuasca, I will give you, just an example. Is a true story from a mestizo community, and it was about a man in Peru. It was a man who's in the jungle, and it was a man whose son disappeared. He was an 8-year-old boy, and one day he didn't come back, and it was 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and the father was really worried, and he decided to drink ayahuasca to see what happened with his son. And he drank ayahuasca, and ayahuasca told him that his neighbor had killed his son. So the next morning he went and killed his neighbor. And 2 days later, his son reappeared. He had gotten lost in the jungle, and there he was. So ayahuasca, ayahuasca told me there is I would say the science and the art of drinking ayahuasca has to do with how one deals with this. How one learns to deal with what ayahuasca tells you. Now, usually in places that have a strong tradition of use, they have quite good techniques around this and sort of tips and knowledges. Like I gave the example of the União da Vegetal. The União da Vegetal as a church, I think it's about 60 years old. But so that supposedly it's much older, but let's just see, it's been incorporated as a church 60 years since it was refounded in Brazil. So, that's at least 6 decades actually thinking about this. Thousands of people. And they have developed. And so have the indigenous groups, and so have, I find this becomes a bigger problem as we get further and further from the source and farther from the traditions. And there you have people, or we have a tendency to take everything at face value. When in reality, it could be that ayahuasca speaks in truths that are not necessarily physical truths, but that they are internal truths. So ayahuasca doesn't tell you to quit your job. Ayahuasca tells you that you hate your job. This, another person I have a lot of respect for told me that messages from the spiritual world never come as orders. Never. If you receive it as a sort of, you have no choice but to do this or that, then it's probably not coming from the spiritual world, because the spiritual world always presents choices. So you will see that very often some of the strongest visions that you will have, some of the strongest visions that I've had, actually presented themselves as a choice. I was faced with someone and I had to choose whether to engage with it or not, whether to take the gift that was offered or not, whether to accept or not, whether to engage or not. If I was not told, you have to do this or you have to do that. I was presented with a choice. That, for example, is also sort of a good rule of thumb for discernment. But again, it's, I think what you ask, I myself struggle with this. We all do. I mean, this is the toughest. This is the real. This is the work.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered that beautifully. A big part of your work is, as you said, is this idea of like having a lighthouse, having a beacon, kind of an idea at the end of the tunnel, so that we know where we're actually going towards. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that, and then also this idea, as this work begins to expand globally, which I think, as you said very wisely, is not some new phenomenon. It's in a sense a natural progression of the movement of the plant itself. Also, as you mentioned, that there's so many different ways that this plant has been worked with, and it seems, at least for now, there's very much this idea of personal growth, of insight, but that very much the way that it's moving out into the world is kind of this idea of psychedelic assisted therapy, where it's maybe being done in a clinical setting by psychologists. It's very much individual. It's very much to treat something. There's something wrong, and and we need this plant to fix it or to give us insight. And obviously, there's a real value in that. As you said, that the reason people are working with a plant like ayahuasca is they're getting real benefit, and that's undeniable. So, what do you think are some of the benefits of that, and also, the drawbacks? Obviously, as I think I heard you speaking about, one of the real drawbacks is it's putting it in a very particular box, which kind of cuts, in a sense, some of these commonalities that you mentioned, this idea of some connection, whether that's to community, to spirit, to God, to some higher purpose. And then at the same time, this idea that it's moving from this very diverse way to something that's very, very specific. Even this idea of like psychologizing something, that's a very specific way of looking at the world, which potentially, someone could argue cuts maybe even the main thing that this plant has been worked for, which is maybe something deeper, that's beyond maybe something that we perceive on the surface, but they're, kind of like, as you were mentioning, that this idea of transparency, it could seemingly be very easy to get lost in those layers if all of the other things are not taken into account. The culture, the history, the songs, the set and setting, the having a teacher who's maybe worked with these things. I mean, these are things that have always been seen as very important. And maybe they are, maybe they're not. I guess one could argue either way, but it's taking it and putting it in a very particular set and setting. So again, I know that's a big question, but kind of that idea, and then also maybe speaking a bit about what you see as that lighthouse, like what you and ICEERS are actually working towards.
Yeah, I mean, what you speak about is exactly, the concern that we all have. I think the psychedelic renaissance is a wonderful thing. I'm very glad that is happening, and that the paths are being open for sort of close kin of these plants. I would say those are bigger substances to become medicines, that are integrated into our medical system, and that even psychiatrists can prescribe and that even health insurance can cover. I think that's a wonderful thing. I think it's happening because there's a deep need for it. And I also think that entire process does not need my help at all. It's doing very well by itself, and it will continue to do very well by itself. There's money, there's interest, there's investment, there's a push. So I think it's going to go the way things go in our society, and it's unstoppable. I think it's useful to critique it, but I think it's also useful to understand that I don't think it's going to go away, and it's going to go the way things in our society goes. What I am interested in or concerned with is what gets lost in the way, what is amputated, right? Because we're choosing a very particular use, which is medical. So in the way our society works, in order to prescribe a medicine, you need to have a diagnosis for a disease or a condition. So you need a diagnosis, and then you have a medicine for that diagnosis. And then the doctor makes a diagnosis and prescribes the medicine. So for this, psychedelics are now being researched for depression, for PTSD, for, suicidal thoughts, for a whole number of things. Now, this is going to be in a very medical context. It looks like the person very often will lay down. Our psychiatrists, they don't know how to sing songs usually, and they don't know how to make rituals either, usually. Our psychologists, they tend to lay people down on a couch, which comes from Freud. They put a mask on them. They put some pre-recorded music with headphones. They give them a substance, and they're there to help in case the person needs it. But mostly they just sit there and they're waiting for the person to come out of the experience so they can talk about it. This is our tradition. Psychologists talk to people after the experience and before. I think this is all very good, really. Now, however, when I look also at what is being left out. Now, what is being left out of this? What is being left out of this is the fact that the vast majority of people drinking, for example, ayahuasca, whether outside of the countries of origin or in the countries of origin, are actually likely not drinking because of something that you would call a medical diagnosis, or that could be a medical diagnosis. They drink for a wide variety of things, having to do with adaptogenic. They drink because they can't find their son, because they don't know what to do with their neighbors, because they're fighting with their wives, because they have a struggle relationship with their father, because they feel unlucky or sick, because in the West they don't know what to do with their lives or with their jobs or with so there's a sort of very interesting fact, which is that the vast use of psychedelics in the world is actually for non-medical issues, what we would characterize as non-medical issues. So for me, I think this is the second revolution that will come after the necessary medical revolution, that is happening outside of the countries of origin around psychedelics. Now it's all very medicalized, but I think the actual really interesting, and important work that these plants will do will not be as medicines for certain conditions, which will be very important, but will be much, much wider. And it will be non-medical uses, having to do with meaning making, with sense, with what an indigenous Kofan man described to me as how to live, which I think is really the best summary of the whole thing. He said, Yahe, which is what they call ayahuasca, it's a plant that teaches human beings how to live. And that's not, sometimes that has medical diagnosis, but very, very often it doesn't. But that's what it does, right? How should I live? With myself, with my neighbors, in my relationships, with other people, with nature, with the non-human, with everything. So that's why the work that I'm doing precisely revolves around this, and that's why I said the ceremonial use of plants outside of the countries of origin. So the countries of origin, they don't need they have their own cultures, very strong ways to work with it. They don't need my help. I'm concerned, or my work is focused outside of the country's origin, and it's focused on something that I think is, if things don't go right, or if we're not careful, it is the aspect that is most likely to get steamrolled by the psychedelic renaissance, which is the ceremonial use of these plants for non-medical uses in a community context or in a group context. So the part that actually resembles most what happened on the origin is the part that is most likely to get lost. And I think that would be a tragic. Now, it's very easy for us to, not very easy, but it's easy to think about, to turn plants into prescription, into molecules and into prescription drugs that our doctors can prescribe and our insurance companies can cover. It's very hard for us to think of a practice that involves hallucinogenic plants that is not medical, that is handled by people who are not necessarily medical professionals, for people who do not necessarily have a diagnosis, that is part spiritual, but is not exactly a church as we understand spirituality, and that it has to do with personal growth, but it's not exactly therapy as we understand therapy. Now, this is a much more difficult fit. No, and an example for this makes it easier to understand, I think, is yoga. We all know what yoga is, but yoga originally was a practice, a spiritual practice from India that was sort of a moving meditation, or if you want, something that combined movement and prayer. But it was a spiritual purpose, reaching enlightenment through movement. So when yoga arrives to our countries, outside of the countries of origin, outside of India, now we don't have a place for something that combines movement and prayer. We don't. We don't have a space in our culture for it. What we do have is we have a space for movement. It's called the gym. That's where people move, is the gym. And then where people pray is the church. And there's nothing in between. So where does yoga end up? In the gym. And it ends up in the gym, and it begins to lose a lot of its spiritual. The Sanskrit gets lost. A lot of the spiritual sort of reach for enlightenment thing gets lost, and it turns into an issue of like feeling good, dealing with stress, having a beautiful body, and being fit, that gets potentialized because that's what the gym does. And then in the process, it loses a lot of its traditional sort of spiritual aspects. Now, I think it's important to note that this is also temporary. That is that's how it spread. But apparently now within the yoga world, there's a sort of second wave of interest, and people are again learning Sanskrit, and they're looking towards the spiritual aspects of it. So things expand in movements of dilution. When things expand, they tend to dilute. And then once they expanded, they tend to concentrate again. And that's how sort of things move, right? So I am worried that the same thing will happen to, something that is very near to my heart, which is, sort of ceremonial, what I saw in South America, the sort of ceremonial use of plants within certain cultural context. So the work that we're trying to do is trying to exactly think about this. How would that fit? Now, this is a very preliminary results. We're not nearly done, but some things that are becoming obvious is that one is that most likely you cannot fight the doctors, the medical system. So this could survive as non-medical uses. So people who have medical conditions, people with depression, with PTSD, with whatever, in this hypothetical world of the future, they will do well starting with the medical system. and get your psychiatrist to prescribe you whatever. And that's where, also because quite honestly, there is now for example, in Spain, people who serious medical conditions that are coming to drink ayahuasca, and the person who are giving them ayahuasca are not capable. They don't have the training to deal with somebody who's severely depressed or with PTSD, and because it's very specific and difficult and complex to work with people like that. It's no joke. So, shape that it begins to, it could take. One is non-medical. The second has to do with something that I would call group-based, community-based, or non-profit. It has to do with the ability to attend a lot more people at one time than when you get in the individual psychedelic therapy, which is one person and one therapist. These things happen in group, the sharing happens in group, and there's also a whole other dynamic in terms of the social relationships and what happens to people when they start drinking ayahuasca and they join a group of people drinking ayahuasca. That is a group of people committed with a certain growth, looking at certain things in themselves. This is already very different. It's a community of practice. It's a group of people who are engaged in a very particular practice with a very particular direction. And that is actually quite different from, perhaps very often from the interests of most of their friends or the families of other people. There is also some very important healing that happens there. And also very important problems, because very often people decide that their ayahuasca family is their real family and that the real family doesn't know them, and this creates other issues. So in terms of and then I would add also one last thing, and is that in our societies we get quite good at stuff if we are allowed to practice and experiment. So I will give you an example. 20 years ago, people could not draw anything with the foam in the form of a cappuccino. This is like, maybe last 20 years, 25 years, I don't know how long this has been going on, that people are making drawings in the form of cappuccino, not very long, but in that short period, we've gone from making a simple flower to, really, incredible works of art, complex portraits being drawn on foam, right? This is not just that, you can see it, for example, with, the way people with skateboarding or with surfing or with all of these new sports that sort of suddenly emerge, suddenly like a new thing will come. And then, within 15, 20 years, people are doing, amazing stuff around it, sort of circus tricks. We get pretty good. We learn from one another, knowledge goes, and people practice and people make mistakes, and then people get really quite good at it. This does not happen when people have to work isolated, atomized, and underground. So this is the reason why, even though we've gotten really good at making foam and we've been consuming LSD now for 60 years, 70 years. And we haven't gotten super, super good at it. And that's because this sort of flow of information that happens between people, where they learn from one another and they share, and then it moves very fast, it's blocked by the way that it's sort of underground and hidden and clandestine. I believe, when I look at the way people are serving ayahuasca, for example, in Spain, I see everything. I see people who are doing what I believe is very, very good job. Very, very good work. And I see people who are doing what I believe is really quite poor work. There is no doubt in my mind that 15 or 20 years from now, the average will be much, much better than what it is now. So this is going to get better and better and better. People will learn, and part of work, what we do is we try to facilitate that by publishing guides, by gathering best practices, and this is part of the work that ICEERS does and that I do as well. So what I would like to imagine, it's something like this. And now we're going utopian. A few decades in the future, outside every city, there will be a number of places that are in a beautiful place in nature. And they're sort of big centers. And in these places, people who are having difficulties, they're having a difficult time in their life, or they're too stressed out, or they don't know what to do with themselves, or they can make up their mind, they're in some sort of process, or they're in some sort of crisis, then they can go to these places. But not medical condition. If it's a medical condition, it's somewhere else. They can go to these places. Now, in these places, there are people who are trained in the use of these plants. And they are basically, what they're doing is they're helping people go through these processes with the support of these plants. So this place becomes I don't know what to call it, a retreat, a resting place, a place. I don't. The word is healed, but I shouldn't. And probably in the future they won't be able to use it either because of the tension with medical things. But that's what's going on. Now, that would be the adaptogenic use. An important part of this is that it would need to be. An important part of this is that this already sort of exists, but it's too expensive. It's too expensive for most people. So for the large, you need to be in a fairly, I know most of us don't consider ourselves to be well off, but actually, if we can afford to go to South America to drink ayahuasca every once in a while, or even to drink ayahuasca on the weekend and stuff, we are better off than most people, even in Western societies. I think the other reason that the sort of non-profit aspect of it, I think it's important, though there would also be, of course, for-profit ventures, is that would keep things from a certain tension that always builds around this. And this, for example, I think that the Ayahuasca churches in Brazil are a very good example. They've dealt with this issue of money around ceremony now for a long time. When you are making a living out of serving plants, it might be that you'll be tempted to bend the rules because you need the money. You need more money, so normally you can only accept 20 people in a ceremony because more is hard to handle, but you need money, so you're going to accept 25. Or you already ran 2 ceremonies and you're very tired and you shouldn't run a third one, but you need the money, so you will run the third one. This again is very interesting. It's very interesting to me how this works in the Brazilian ayahuasca churches, where just about everybody has a day job, and what they do with ayahuasca, it happens on the weekends and it's considered their spiritual work, but not their profession. There's also nothing wrong with it being your profession. What worries me is the tendency of our society to optimize benefits and maximize profit. And what happens when you put that together with people going through very deep processes through very vulnerable states? So you're putting together very vulnerable people with the need for profit, and I think that tends to create monsters. That's the United States healthcare system, right? But we see it, for example, also sometimes around education. I think this is just, again, my belief that, perhaps education and healthcare are two things that should not be fully submitted to the forces of the market, because you can, with healthcare, you can blackmail people with healthcare. It's their lives, so people will pay everything they have. So if you don't protect that, somebody will abuse it. Again, what I'm thinking is of a complement or an alternative to psychedelic clinics that are, with staffed by medical doctors and covered by insurance. I think those will exist for sure. I would just like to make sure that also the ceremonial plant use, so that revolves around plant, that is a non-medical uses, and there is sort of group and community based, and ideally also with a different relationship to profit, also survives and also exists and also finds a place in our societies. Because I think if it doesn't, something very valuable would be lost around this type of work. And there is place for both things. They complement each other. They need each other, and they're both necessary. I think, for example, on the long term, once I was doing, I did a sort of survey of different people working with ayahuasca in Spain, because I wanted to see what were sort of their needs, their unmet needs, and where were they at. And I was asking questions like, what's the ratio in your sessions of newcomers versus regulars? I asked the guy, just to have an idea, is it 40-30, is it 70-30, 40-60? And he told me, that's the wrong question. In my sessions, there's either people who are in process or people who are in maintenance. People who are in process usually arrived not that long ago, and usually they're coming fairly often because they're dealing with something big, which was what drove them to come, and they're coming often. And then it comes to a point where they process whatever it is that they were processing, and they get to a better place, and then they come less and less often. Then they come from maintenance. Then I begin to see them once or twice a year. Right. I think this is also a reality, and it could be that, again, the more medical aspects of psychedelics is better for process, and the communal aspects is better for maintenance. Things would have to find their own place. What I would not like to see is the sort of let's call it, just again to use very stereotypical words, I wouldn't like to see Amazonian shamans become the equivalent of become in the psychedelic clinics of the future, the equivalent of the musicians in the Irish taverns all over the world. So there's this sort of musical accompaniment that sort of brings this sort of cultural, like there's the Irish tavern that makes it look like you're in Ireland, and now we have a musician that sings the song so that you also feel you're in Ireland instead of Thailand or whatever, right? I would hate for the traditional practices to become somehow a colorful thing that is added within a business, in business-minded psychedelic clinics, and then bring somebody to make some music and add some color. right? And of course that will happen, you know. So what alternatives can we build and begin to build to make sure that that's not the only thing that happens?
Yeah, great. A word I often hear that people will use when they begin working with some of these plants like ayahuasca is this, they use this word remembering. And it's like there's this sense of remembering. And I've heard it from a lot of, for lack of a better word, Western people, but also indigenous people too. A lot of these myths or stories that I've heard often come from this idea that humanity forgot who he is, who she is. And these plants help us to remember that essentially they were given by spirit so that we can remember who we are, where we came from, as this guy in the, I believe you said that the Putumayo area said, it's so that we can learn how to live. Or as this other guy said, like it's this school for adults, you know, like to remember where we come from, who we are, what is good, what does it mean to be a good person, to live a good life. Do you think, because often we talk about these medicines and we'll use this term indigenous, and we have like a very particular, there's something very particular that's brought up, like often like these very primitive societies that are very far removed from outside civilization, and that these things only exist there, that it's somehow like correlated to this more like, again, for lack of a better word, this more primitive state that people are living in. So, you know, there's often this like idea, but with these ideas of like using ayahuasca or plant medicine, there's also de facto, it means you have this animistic view of the world. And it's, you know, it's a very particular set of circumstances that those arose in. But what I find is interesting is often this word of remembering. It's like this idea that everyone is in a way remembering this story of where they came from, these practices. And so I guess the question is, do you have a sense that in, you know, again, what we may call the Western world, that the reason also that these plants are expanding are because we forgot that story, we forgot where we came from, we forgot these rites and rituals and ceremonies and communal aspects, which maybe there's still traces of in these things like the Lucian rites or the Dionysian rites, or you look at Druidic culture and there's this real reverence of trees and plants and these idea of spirits, and that different trees have spirits in the same way that maybe in the Amazon they would say every tree has a madre or a dueño. That there's, you know, there's still this connection that you can see in other places in the world, but that maybe it's been lost in the same way that, as you were describing when you went to Mexico, like with the expansion of more of this kind of outside world, those traditions are being lost or already lost. And so it's kind of this interesting thing that, you know, maybe in the Amazon or some of these places that are very isolated, high up in the mountains, some of these traditions have survived, maybe just because there wasn't that natural expansion of an outside world that had become disconnected. But so I guess the question is, do you think at the root, those things are very specific to those places, or it's something more universal that was found all over the world that just so many people have forgotten, moved away from for whatever those reasons may be?
Yeah, I have another story about remembering. It's something I heard of in the Santo Daime, and they said, you know, when a person begins to drink daime, which is what they call ayahuasca, the first thing that happens is that they remember everything. And it's not until they remember everything that they can pass to the next level, which is for them the spiritual one. You know, for them remembering also has to do sort of autobiographical and stuff. So, and you know, in ICEERS, this idea of remembering who you are is very strong at the core of. Now, another story that I heard somewhere else in Peru was that But this person said is actually what the characteristic of ayahuasca is, that is what it brings is reconciliation, is that a plant that reconciles people with themselves, with the neighbors, with each other, but also eventually with their culture and their tradition. I've had personal experience of all of the above, like you, everything that you mentioned. You know, I've been lucky to, because of the documentary and stuff, to, you know, visit some quite traditional societies where I saw some amazing things that felt very true and very much sort of a birthright of human beings. You know, something that was deeply natural to human beings, not just sort of like a, you know, interesting cultural event, but actually something very profoundly human that was being displayed, and that me and in my society, in my culture, we have forgotten how to do. And I've seen people get close to that through plants. And I have also seen people, you know, in some countries where it's quite, you know, something's happening, for example, interesting, I would say in the Netherlands, where now there's a sort of already a generation of people that are working with ayahuasca, but they don't work with ayahuasca, they work with anahuasca. So they make mimosa and Syrian rue. They cook it at home. They've never been to South America. And they actually don't have very clear links to the cultures of the stuff. It's something else that is emerging. And that's also happening and will happen and will continue to happen, you know, because it's also, you know, for many years, I told anybody who would listen to me that the people who really know about ayahuasca are indigenous Amazonians. And if you haven't drunk with them, then you don't know what this is all about. Now, I still believe this, but I also realized with time that if everybody listened to me, I would provoke a sustainability crisis in the jungle that would be the end of those cultures that I appreciate so much. There's already not enough taitas, shamans, curanderos, payés, mestres, you know, in the entire Amazon to supply, you know, all the people outside of the Amazon who would potentially be interested in participating in this. So protecting those cultures also involves or somehow includes this sort of other things that are happening, like, you know, people making anahuasca and never going to Brazil, never going to the jungle. As much as I, you know, love and appreciate the tradition. And then the other thing is that I think these things are extremely contextual. So we tend to look at the Yurupari dance, you know, and put it like this should be preserved, like this should be preserved, like, I don't know, like the carnival should be preserved, or like these clothes or these songs, or this sort of like cultural preservation sort of aspect of it. But the fact is that that dance is tied up to something in the calendar. So it's the fish are going up and then you're going to fish them. And it's tied up to the time of the year and what is happening in nature and where you're living and what the weather is. If you remove these things and you keep the dance, you've also done an amputation, right? So you see, like, so you could see, for example, rituals that, you know, Inuit people would practice around the hunting of the whale, and very important ritual aspects and ceremonial aspects. If people stop hunting whales, then what you have is sort of, and you're keeping the dance, you have this sort of folkloric, you know, then it becomes something, it is at its most powerful, ritual is at its most powerful when it's an outward manifestation of an inner process. So the fish are coming up and you are connected to the place where you live and you're doing this dance. If you remove all of these things and you just keep the dance, you're missing a large part of the game. No? So, well, I think that, and I myself have received, you know, huge teachings and learning and inspiration from, and I've read so much anthropology and, you know, I've worked on documentaries and live with indigenous groups and all of these, so much inspiration from them and their cultures. I realized too that almost every time I was most likely misunderstanding, 80% of it. And that it will always be like that. That I will never learn to see like a shipibo or even to fully understand. However, the encounter and the attempt to understand, it's incredibly useful in what it inspires in oneself. So I think the mistake that we very often make is that say, oh, I learned this and this practice from indigenous groups, people who spend time living with indigenous groups, and the thing is like, no, what you're just, no, you saw indigenous people do this and that inspired this other thing in you that is not that, because it can't, and if you try for it to be that, then you'll be taking something that is not yours. However, what you can get out of this, it's a sort of inspiration. So I find very interesting, for example, groups of people that are now working without plants or psychedelics, that are working on rites of passage and bringing rites of passage back for basically for Western people. Now, when these people started doing this, 30 or 40 years ago, they were copying indigenous rituals. They were looking at rites of, they said, we lost it in our culture. And in these cultures, it's still very much alive. It's very important that young people go through this. So they would basically copy the rituals and the songs and all of this. And then they realized, of course, that this is very wrong. And that's not what it's about. There's a lot that you can learn from the way other people do initiation rituals. Many, many things that you can learn, except how to do initiation rituals like they do. That you will never learn. And in attempting to do it, you will do harm, you will be incredibly disrespectful, and you'll be taking something that is not yours. So how we learn to do this, again, in alliance, in reciprocity, in respect, so that we can benefit from this encounter, because it's true, we have lost these things. We don't know how to die. We don't know how to be born. We do such a crap job at this. We don't know how to accompany our young people into adulthood. So basically we as a society suck at the most important periods of our lives. Right? These are passages, right? These are the most important times in our lives, and we do it so badly compared to people who, to traditional groups. But we cannot directly learn from them, but we can get great inspiration. So I think this is where, because our context is so different, this is the problem, is that what you cannot never get back is it's a tribal context. Especially, I think, if we believe, and this is part of how we get everything wrong, that that getting together with like-minded people, it's somehow a tribe. Now, this is the opposite of a tribe. This is an affinity group. A tribe is not a group of people you choose. It's a group of people you're born with and you have to live with for the rest of your life. It's the opposite of the group of people that get together in Burning Man. No offense, all my love for Burning Man, but that's an affinity group of people who have different tribes, and then they get together, and so when you understand that people in tribal groups, they are there for life, and they cannot live easily, and they have to live with the same people, and they cannot, and then you understand how important the rituals where the songs are sung and who we are and where we come from, and the role that the plants do in sort of in ironing out all of these sort of interpersonal difficulties that we just avoid by moving to cities and not talking to one another. So is this sort of very fine, I would say, I will go back to the question of discernment that you made, it's very important to, I think, in this process, in the encounter with this sort of, traditional cultures and what we have lost and forgotten, that we need to remember, and how that can happen in this encounter. It's also very easy to, like the other stuff, to mistake ego with intuition and truth, and then to begin to take and to copy and to do all of these terrible things that we tend to do. And it's because of that same thing. It's because of not being careful enough with how we listen. I hope that made sense. It's also a very complex topic.
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean, you kind of answered it in a way, but the next question I wanted to ask was this idea, you mentioned it earlier, of cultural appropriation, and it was something you said you were very passionate for a while, but now you're saying you think there's others who are kind of taking that lead. But I guess the question would be, what advice do you have about that? Because again, it is such a complicated, complex topic, and it's often presented in this very black and white way, and yet not seeing like all of the nuance. I mean, even as I think you said, like the Brazilian church of Santo Daime is such a beautiful kind of metaphor of there's this incredibly beautiful and unique dance, of all of these cultures coming together, and really throughout the history of the world, things have been like that. There's always cross-cultural, nothing is one way and not, to some degree the other. And I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is never spoken of this way, but I guess that could be considered cultural appropriation, as I'm not Brazilian. But something I find really beautiful with that, and it traditionally it was practiced in a kimono and a gi, and even the school where I practice, I always found it really beautiful because on the wall there was a photo of the lineage of the people that it came from. And to me, that felt really important. It was like really, every time I would come in, and not necessarily every time, but when I would look at that, there was like a real lineage that I could trace. Like, wow, my teacher got it from him, and he got it from him, and he got it from him. And even though I didn't know these people, like I thank them in a way, that they passed on their knowledge. And that's something I see a lot less now in jiu-jitsu. Like very few studios will have that lineage, those photos on the wall. It's also moving away from kimono. Like the more common way it's practiced now is just with without a gi, just kind of with normal clothes, and because it kind of mimics culturally now what we do. Like people just wear clothes. It's not like 18th century Japan where people were wearing kimonos because that's what they wore. Nobody wears that anymore. So I can understand the natural evolution, and even a lot of jiu-jitsu, there was very particular rules that came really from a time and a place where those rules were maybe more applicable, but now they may not be. An example is earlier on, people didn't do a lot of leg locks, but now that's actually like the most common thing that people are really like fascinated by. And a huge reason was because it wasn't practiced. It was like this mystery that no one was exploring, and now it's like super effective because no one did it. And so now there's all of this information to be learned, and it's changing so much. I mean, jiu-jitsu has probably changed. People often say this, like with mixed martial arts, like it's changed more in the past 20 years than in the past 200 years. Also because of this idea that you were speaking of, like, one of the good things of the West is this like innovation, this like rapid ability to change something. So I guess what advice would you have about kind of those two sides, like really maintaining that tradition, honoring that, honoring the cultures where it came from, these rites and rituals, and then also at the same time, what you were alluding to is is, any of these things, if kind of taken out of context, they also lose their meaning, and they also may not be serving as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, yeah, I mean, when I started speaking about this, which is around 2005, the only people that were talking about this were basically anthropologists and Native American activists from the United States who had been, they were very much on the first row of this, right? And what's happened to Native American spirituality in terms of, I'm speaking of Native American spirituality in terms of appropriation, it's been just absolutely brutal, especially the Lakota. Which has gotten, but with time, this has sort of come all the way to the surface, of the culture. It's become quite spoken about, and also it's taking a very polarized view where I myself, because like you said, I tend to stand in the middle. I see very, very, very extreme positions on both ends of the spectrum that I'm sort of uncomfortable with. The side that says, "Oh, leave me alone, anything goes," and the side that says, "You can't, you can't, nothing, because it's all nothing, for the cultures." I think one thing that is useful for me, it's to think that if you're interested in other cultures' practices, be it Buddhism, be it Amazonian shamanism, be Lakota spirituality, it's all good and it's important to learn. I myself have read a lot about all three of these things and read a lot and learn a lot, and you can even where there should be a sign, I think, of alarm is where you find yourself in a situation where you're practicing a Native American ritual, for example, a sweat lodge, and you're using all of the names and the inipi and the this and the chanupa and the pipe and the songs and all of this, but you look around and everybody around you is not indigenous, including the person who's hosting it. So you're in a situation where you're running an indigenous ritual theoretically, but nobody there is indigenous. That's a sign, I would say. And then the other sign is how much of this indigenous culture is being taken. I mean, the fact of the matter is, as there's so many white people that have participated in, for example, Lakota rituals and, sweat lodges and even sun dances and many of these things. But there seems to be a very small percentage of them that know that actually, Lakota reservations in the United States, they're considered, it's like they're the most poor areas of the United States. The situation there with drug addiction is appalling. There's the rates of suicide are the highest of anywhere in the United States. Teenagers, so Native American teenagers, they go into these suicide pacts where literally 5 of them would commit suicide at the same time, or 8 of them. If this had happened and it had been white kids, it would have been all over the newspaper. So the situation of, it's great that people become interested in Native American spirituality, or for example, Lakota spirituality. But if you're fascinated by Lakota spirituality and you don't know anything about the day-to-day lives of today's Lakota people, I think there's an alarm there. There's something that people should look at closer. And it's not about yes or no. It's about if you're going to approach a different culture, then approach the whole thing. If you're going to be fascinated, then by all means. I don't think that white people should not ever approach other cultures that is their own or become fascinated or whatever. I would just suggest that if one does it wholeheartedly, because otherwise it feels a little bit manipulative. It feels like you're just taking what you like and dropping the rest, and you're just taking something for your own benefit, but you want the pretty things and the dance and this, but then you don't want the ugly stuff. And, from the point of view of the Lakota, for example, in this case, obviously, it's very insulting and they're not very happy. And it's normal. It's normal that they wouldn't. You wouldn't either. It's easier to think in terms of, I always use this example, but there's the Jewish skull caps, the kippas, which people, you see some people, Jewish people wear. If we imagine that, somewhere very far away, so for example, I don't know, somewhere there's no Jewish people. I mean, but let's say another completely different culture that doesn't exist, some country very, very far away where none of this exists, and it becomes popular among young people to wear the kippas, but sort of like a fashion accessory, the way, some people wear Tibetan prayer beads as a fashion accessory, not as a tool for reciting mantras, probably, the Jewish people who wear kippas and for whom the kippas means something very, very concrete, would not be completely happy about it. Now, it's true that the kippah is only a piece of cloth, and it's true that people should be free to do what they want to do, and that, this is a free world, and who are you to tell me, blah, blah, blah. It's also true. I understand those arguments as well. But you begin to see, I have a tendency to respect things that other people take seriously, even though I don't. So, I myself, personally speaking, would never make a caricature of Muhammad, because I know that for certain, Muslim people, that's really, really insulting. Now, in my culture, making a caricature of Jesus is not, but in their culture it is. And because in their culture it is, I myself would tend not to do something that would greatly insult anybody, because why would you do it? At the same time, in one of these, big arguments that open about this in one of the ayahuasca conferences, there was an anthropologist, Edward McRae, Brazilian anthropologist, and he explained the difference between religion and tradition, as anthropologists see it. As anthropologists see it, religions are very fixed things. They tend to get written down, and they don't easily change their dogma. Traditions, however, are changing all the time, while believing that they've always been the same. So I give you, this is especially true in oral cultures, in cultures that don't write things down. So for example, in Brazil, there's this group that were very isolated until recently. They're called the Soe. They have a big disc on their lips. And they lived, in a very traditional way until very, very recently. So they only came in contact with white people, I believe, somewhere in the 60s. Now, the Zoe, of course, had a number of creation myths that told the story of how the world got created and who they were and all of these. And these were oral traditions. Now, we tend to think that those myths have been repeated for thousands of years and they're the same that they were 500 or 5,000 years ago. The Zoe themselves believed this. However, it was observed that after coming in contact with white people, somewhere within a few decades, the creation myths changed and they included the existence of white people, because in the creation myths before, there was no white people. So they couldn't be accounted for. Now, what this means is that oral cultures are always living in the present. What this also means is that their myths are always true. And this is something that is very valuable about oral cultures, and that religions like ours get in trouble because they get written down and they cannot change. So you will see that by cultural adaptation and in an organic process, Zoe creation myths will always be true. If suddenly something happened that was totally unexpected, Martians arrived, aliens from outer space, and they had never been accounted in their creation myths, the creation myth would also eventually include the aliens, and it would still be absolutely true. and always current and always true, right? But there's something also very beautiful there. All of these things are happening at the same time in what is effectively a minefield of a very dark history, a very bad past that all Westerners have to contend with, a terrible history of colonization and exploitation and genocide and cultural genocide of just about everyone we've come in contact with. And very extreme reactions on both ends of the spectrum. So, for myself, I just try to get informed. I try to stay respectful, and I try to always remember that I am not learning, I'm being inspired. It's very, very, you will not, and I've spent a lot of time reading and being and spend time with indigenous people and questioning them about their cultures and wanting to learn about these things, and still realize that I will most likely never fully get it. And that's not, there's nothing wrong with that unless the problem is making the mistake of thinking that you are, that because they give you a gift or a feather or a pipe or whatever whatever was given to you, that you can actually, that by taking that and copying them, you're actually doing what they're doing. No, it's a very Western thing, to believe that you can grab these things and you can take them for yourself. There's a great story by this anthropologist. And he was working with one of these Yurupari tribes in the Baupes, what I said, the traditional, the most traditional ayahuasca dances, the big community dances. And in these dances, they bring down a box that is hanging on the top of the maloca and has all of these trumpets. And these trumpets are only played during this dance, and the rest of the year they're kept in this box. Now, the women of the tribe, and this is part of the taboos, are not allowed to ever see the trumpets. They cannot see the trumpets. Now, this anthropologist, because he was doing his research, he lived with them many years and he learned the language. And among the things he did is he took pictures of the trumpets. He was a man who was allowed to see them, and he took pictures of the trumpets. And then when he was going to publish the book, he wondered if it would be okay to publish the picture of the trumpets in the book, because the women were not supposed to see him. So he went and he spoke with the shaman of the group, and he said, listen, I'm making this book. He said, yes, I know. And I took a picture of the trumpets. Yes, I know. And I was thinking of putting it in the book. Yes. But then I thought if I put it in the book, maybe some women, even some women from the tribe could see the picture of the trumpets. Do you think, what should I do? And the shaman said, no, I think it's okay that you can put the picture, on the book. And he said, but what if the women see it? And the shaman said, the women cannot see the trumpets, but they can see a picture of the trumpets. What's the problem with that? Right? That gives you an idea of how different we think. Right? And it's about keeping that in mind.
I heard. I think when I reached out to you, I said that I had listened to an interview a number of years back, and I attribute this quote to you. So if you didn't say it, apologies beforehand. But it was a quote that really stuck with me, and I've used a number of times, and because it was something that I really thought, but I never quite put it in the way that you did, which was very simple. Again, I hope you said it, but it's this idea that when the Europeans first came, that they found that the indigenous people were too indigenous, and they wanted to make them more European. And that today there's really that same mentality, but it's the opposite. The Europeans, or the foreigners, not just Europeans now, but people from the outside look at the indigenous, and they often look at them and say, oh no, they've become too European, they need to be more indigenous. Which I think there's a lot of levels to that statement, and a lot of truth that it's pointing towards. So I was just wondering if you can maybe expand upon that, and hopefully, again, hopefully that was you who said it.
Yeah. It was me, and it came. The realization came to me at some point that actually, again, it looks like our attitude and our relationship towards indigenous groups has changed a lot from the times of the colony, because in the times of the colony we believed that they were, backwards, superstitious people that should go extinct, literally, because of evolution, cultural evolution, and we did everything in our power to make that. And now we believe that they might hold some very important secrets about things that we ourselves have forgotten, and that they should be conserved. So it seems like the attitudes are polar opposites, but actually the underlying attitude remains the same, and is that we have constantly told indigenous people, I would like you a little bit, I would like you better if you changed what you are. Now, if you take that out of intercultural relationships and you just put it in personal relationships or in romantic relationships, that's poison, right? That's what would kill love. That's why people talk about unconditional love, right? If you approach your partner with this thought, I would like you better if this and that would change about you, your relationship is doomed. And the other person will, of course, receive your love they will not want to receive your love, because they will see that it comes with conditions, right? It's a very bad place to start any relationship with another person, whether it's romantic or friendship or intercultural, or with your children. My father told me that once, that's the work of the devil. That's the work of the devil. I would love you better if you only change this little thing. That's how the devil works. So yeah, and it's, again, this is what I mean. At least for me, what is incredibly valuable of the encounter with other cultures, is that you think you're learning about them, but you're actually learning about yourself. But this is not just with other cultures, it's with any other. This also happens in love relationships. The encounter with the other, that is another person with another history, another life, and you think you can understand, but you can't, and you talk, but you misunderstand each other, and all of this, at the end, if done correctly, becomes the biggest teacher about who you are that you can find.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I know we're coming up on 2 hours. There's a couple other things I wanted to ask you. One is about the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, because I think that's a really interesting project that ICEERS does. So yeah, maybe if you can talk about that, and also maybe just the work of ICEERS as a whole, because I know some of the audience has heard of ICEERS, but I imagine a lot of people haven't. And just maybe describing, because I think it's a beautiful organization, and you all are doing beautiful work. So if you could maybe describe a little bit about ICEERS, and also the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, because I think that's a really important thing that maybe a lot of people don't necessarily know, like what's happening with, as you said, some of these people who are genuinely trying to do good by practicing their work, and what some of the challenges they're facing are.
Yeah, ICEERS is the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Services. So that's, you see, it's a mouthful, is very broad: education, research, and services. The good part about that is that basically that means that we have a very broad mandate. So if you are we're an NGO, if you're the NGO for the protection of the rhinoceros, you're going to be stuck with rhinoceros. You can't do anything about the whales. That's good or bad. Now in ICEERS, we're limited to, what we have called ethnobotanicals, and botanicals are psychoactive plants that have a history of traditional use. So we don't work with MDMA, or we don't work with DMT or extracted substances. We focused on the plants, and also, on the cultures from where it originates. Other than that, the mandate is pretty broad, and that means that we can do things as they're needed, as the community needs. So, for example, there's been a lot of people who got into legal problem with working with ayahuasca. We started a legal fund that basically helps people through their trials. So that means that we can advise lawyers on defense strategies. We can provide expert witnesses that come and declare at the trial. We can, usually people, when they get arrested with this, because it's very new, they don't know what to do, and their lawyers don't know what to do. So we hope that's one of the things. So, you can look at for Ayahuasca Defense Fund if you're ever in trouble, or if you have doubts or questions about the legal status of ayahuasca. There's other things that we do that are very much tied to scientific research. These usually go around looking for the things that are not the holes in the research, the holes in what science does not yet know about these plants. And we tend to focus on this because, again, it's an NGO, so it's a kind of a strategic research. Now, for example, like we spoke, there's been a lot of research around medical uses of these plants, but there's not been very much research at all about, what normal people are doing with these plants. Now, we've been doing this research now in Spain, coming in the Netherlands, and we'll be doing in other countries, using global mental health markers to be able to paint a sort of portrait of what your quote unquote average ayahuasca drinker in these countries is like. And the result is quite surprising, because it's very different from your average. So that there's the legal aspect, there's the research aspect, and then in terms of education of research, there's a very important aspect having to do with indigenous cultures and relationships with it, which is now taking a bigger aspect. And we also do things like create spaces where the community can gather and foster, like, for example, the Ayahuasca conferences, 3 World Ayahuasca conferences that we organize, which are, again, we try to keep price tickets low. They're non-profit events, so we're not a business, we're an NGO. But we realize that it's important to create an event where people from all over the world can gather and talk about these practices, and not only gather, but have a number of important closed-door meetings between lawyers from different countries, between people doing policy work at sort of like international level, UN, etc., strategy meetings, all of these things. So we foster what we and support and accompany what we believe is needed in order for these plants and the cultures from where they originate to not just survive but also thrive, at a sort of worldwide level. So I think it's a little bit like what I described about the different uses of ayahuasca. If you look at all the different ICEERS projects, they would seem very, very varied. And it's a very diverse group of people. There's some people that know a lot about ibogaine. There are people that are very fixated on ayahuasca, like myself. There's people who are very close more to policy work, and at the international level, people who do a lot of work with cannabis and cannabis activism. It's very diverse and broad, the different projects that we do, but they all have this in common, that we believe that there is great promise to these plants, that have these psychoactive plants that have a history of traditional use, and that's why they have a history of traditional use, because there's great promise to them. And then we would like to see that promise come true in our societies, because that promise, in a sense, is coming true in the places of origin, or is in a much better place. And we would also like to protect and help, the process happening at the places of origin. So help these plants gain legitimacy at the worldwide level. I'm probably going to get called on for this by our communications director for doing such a bad job at this as soon as she listens to this. But I think it's an okay summary. People will get the idea and they can learn more in our website. And next time I'm going to sit down with the communications director and get fully, get the party line straight.
Jerónimo, this was wonderful. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we didn't address that you feel is important?
I think it's very useful always to try to think at least part of the time in long term. When you look, we tend to be, as a culture, obsessed with the current affairs. And right now there's a lot happening for psychedelics in terms of current affairs. I think it's useful to think 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, at least to do the exercise. Because otherwise one gets caught up in the news cycle. I would say that would be my final contribution.
Do you have a sense? I mean, I know it's impossible to predict, and you mentioned it a little bit, some of these ideas like that ICEERS has and that you have, but do you have a sense of in 50 years? Because that's an important topic. You often hear that some groups of people will say like every action should be taken into account, like this idea of like 7 generations into the future. Mm-hmm. What am I seeding? What am I planting seeds for? So, you mentioned this idea of like in a utopian world that there'll be maybe these centers that people can go, and is that where you see things maybe in 50, 60 years, that they're this kind of, as you say, this psychedelic renaissance that will begin to kind of spread and go to this maybe layer that's more closely related to how these plants were being worked with, and that this is something that in a sense will be maybe fully integrated into cultures all over the world?
I think it fully depends on us, right? There's a great quote that I often use by Alan Kay, and he says, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. That's how it works, right? If you look at how people imagine cars would look like in the future, in science fiction films, they were really streamlined and sort of, right? And now you look at cars and they're sort of beginning to look like that. It's not because those people predicted the future. It's because they invented the future, and then when people wanted to make something futuristic, they copied that, and then at the end, the future resembles what people imagined the future was going to be. That's how it works, right? So the important image of these centers of the future is that when you create this image and you imagine it and you flesh it out and you give it detail and you to the point where you're like, oh, but that could be possible. Then you create a sort of an attractor if the story is good enough. and then things would sort of tend towards that. And this when people don't know what to do, then they will move towards that. That's what the lighthouse is. It marks the. So this is not just for. This applies not just for the future of psychedelics, but the post-carbon world and whatever global warming, all of this. I think the biggest crisis now in our time is that we have lost. Our parents had an idea and before that things were sort of going to go the same. There could be more technology or more this or that, but people will still be living in the world. And now we're coming to a place where we don't know if anything is going to survive. Anything, animals, nature, humans. So we don't have that. And then when you don't have that, then life actually becomes quite uncertain and desperate. And it's simply because we didn't sit down. There's a great, I saw recently, there's great stuff coming out of science fiction around sort of post-carbon, post-global warming stories about what the world looks like. And it's fantastic because then you're like, no. There could be many different ways in which the future could play out. But right now, most of us don't have any. And that just leaves fear. Like, oh, what's going to happen? How am I going to survive? And, usually us from our generation, we're like, oh, we'll probably, it's going to get worse, but we will die before it gets really bad. And then we're just like literally, they have that secret hope. And now we're, dumping the entire thing on the next generation, right? Which are, of course, going to hate us, if all of this comes out to be true, the global warming and all of these. And, we will be the most malign, hated generation in the history of humanity. The ones that could fix everything, the last ones that could fix it and didn't. So, in those terms, a lot of the work and the work that is very important, but I'm not the only person. Many people are saying this, and Charles Eisenstein among them. There is a new story that needs to emerge. It's in the process. It's just, you see hints here and there, but it's not fully fleshed out. It's not complete. It's not, and it's that story what will get us out of this mess. And it's how one sort of, contributes to this, in that story. I think the plants will be a piece, and it will be an important piece. But also the passage rituals, also the sort of things that are, inspired from indigenous people but not copied. I think all of these things will have a part in that new story. But it has to begin. It's sort of a collective work to begin to bring it out and to flesh it out.
Well, beautiful, my friend. That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. As I said in the beginning, I think you have a beautiful way of sharing and a really important voice, and one that I think really reflects your wisdom, the work you've done to really see things from all of these sides and come up with, really coherent and beautiful ways of expressing that. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your voice, and I hope a lot of people listen to this and take to heart what you say, and with everything, take everything with a grain of salt that we all say. But I think you have a lot of wisdom to share, and I thank you for coming on. If people are interested in learning more about you, or I don't know if contacting you is an ability, but is there a way people can do that?
Sure. I mean, I have a Twitter, I have that I barely touch. I have a Facebook, but if you just, Google my name, Jerónimo, and then ayahuasca, you can find, most of my talks and my email is just jeronimo@iceers.org. So it's very, very easy. And thank you for your kind words. That was very lovely. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And at some point in the future, I hope we can do a round two, because I think there's still a lot we could talk about. So thank you, Jerónimo. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That'd be lovely. Anytime. Take care.
All right, everybody, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jerónimo. I very much enjoyed speaking with him. I think he's one of the real wise and measured voices in this world and this work. So it was really a pleasure for me to sit down and speak with him and allow him to share his wisdom. I think it's a really important voice, and I think the more people like him get out there, the better we all are. So that's it for today's show. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, if you feel like you're gaining something from it and you have the ability to give back, that's a really big help to me to continue to be able to bring on these guests. Patreon is a really good way. It's a subscription service. There's different tiers you can sign up for, starting for as little as $1 a month. With the different tiers, there's different things you get back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&A, and it's a really kind of beautiful way to support me, to support this podcast, and also with this idea of INI and reciprocity. There's also the ability to direct donate via PayPal, and also with the YouTube channel now, there's the option to join the channel, giving a lot of the same perks as the Patreon page. To all the people who have done that, who have supported, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, especially to all the patrons. If you're not able to do that, subscribing to the show is a really big help. It may seem like a small thing, but it really helps with the algorithms. So if you're listening to this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, that's a really big help. And then with the audio version, whatever format you're listening, but also if you can go on Apple Podcasts, subscribe, follow to the show, and leave a starred rating and a short review, that's a really big help. So I think that's it. I'm not exactly sure the order of my following guests, although I think I'm going to have a guy who works with Wachuma coming on. Also my friend Sandra is coming on, speaking about herbalism. A guy is coming on to speak about essential oils, an interesting guy. And also Jeremy Narby, who's an anthropologist and author, is going to come on and speak about the new book that he wrote, which is about ayahuasca and tobacco. So that's it. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for the support, and I will see you all on the next episode.